format. And so while my talk won't be as interactive as it usually is, for obvious reasons, I've reworked it to provide some of those elements. And so I hope that we can have plenty of time for questions and answer at the end. So the title here, Native Planting and Other Landscaping Techniques, an Insect's Perspective, is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, of course, because I'm a mammal. Can only get so far in putting myself into insect shoes. However, I do think that there are many ways that we as scientists can examine insects in these landscapes and figure out how we can best support them. Sorry, I was figuring out if my screen was sharing properly, but it appears that it is. So, what's the talk going to be like today? So first of all, I'm briefly going to tell you what my starting perspective is, then make an argument for why we should care about insect populations, particularly within the landscapes in Maryland, and then talk through some strategies for how you might be able to make your landscape more insect friendly. All right, so who's this person who's chattering on about insects on the internet that you've happened across? I basically am a broadly trained community ecologist. I've spent a decent amount of time thinking about how we can support insects and other critters in human-dominated landscapes. Some people might say that landscapes like these that I've shown on the right, people's yards, managed forests, old fields, are unnatural landscapes because we actively manage them as humans. But I think these are places where we actually have a lot of opportunity to make conservation gains because we're doing so much active management within them. That creates a lot of places that we could potentially tweak our actions to create more biodiverse ecosystems. And I come at this through the perspective of plant-insect interactions. This is probably because by the end of my undergraduate, I became really fascinated by the idea that plants aren't just sitting there as sort of static creatures on the landscape, but they're actively responding to the insects that are feeding on them, inducing defenses, trying to avoid being eaten. And then on the flip side, the herbivores are actively trying to exploit every conceivable plant part that you can imagine. So here I've just put together a slide demonstrating some of the many ways that insects use plant tissue. So here we have caterpillars that are feeding on the entire leaf tissue as chewing herbivores. We have lace bugs that pierce their mouth parts into the plant and suck out the cell contents. We have sharpshooters that feed on the fluid coming out of the xylem tissue up from the roots of the plant, and aphids that are feeding on phloem tissue that's rich with the sugars that the plant is fixing. And then we've got some really cool creatures that are wasps that force a plant to produce strange forms with their leaf tissue that then provide homes for the insects. Mites do this as well, as you can see on the bottom right. So it's just really fascinating to me how every part of this plant has been figured out how to be exploited by an herbivore in some way. And I started becoming interested in this when I first got to undergrad. But before that, I'm going to tell you that I come from the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee. So like every scientist, I look at the world through kind of the lens of my own experience. And so these landscapes that I'm showing you here with rhododendron forests and sort of rich moss-covered landscapes are really the plant landscapes that I'm most familiar with. And I've sort of carried that through to think about these relationships in other more managed landscapes. Because I didn't stay in Tennessee forever. As Anne mentioned, I went to undergraduate at the University of Delaware. I spent a number of years doing ecological work there in suburban landscapes. then went up to Connecticut, and now have been back in the Maryland area for about 5 years. And so I'm really pleased to be here. These are the kind of landscapes that I've enjoyed studying, and these are the insects that I know about. But that also gives you kind of the range of my expertise, and will give you an idea about which type of landscapes I can really speak to in this setting. So, why should we care about these insects at all? These plants that I already mentioned, and why a lot of Native Plant Society folks get very excited, is that plants are pretty. Insects bite you. They aren't very kind of pleasant parts of the landscape. And I'm going to argue to you that's patently false, but also they matter a lot ecologically. So these insects are integral parts of food webs. They provide a conduit for all of the energy that's being fixed by the photosynthetic parts of the plants to move up into other parts of the food web. So they support many, many birds and small mammals. Even foxes will eat a good part of their diet as insects. Breeding birds in particular focus and rely on feeding their young insect herbivores for a pretty large part of their diet. Migratory birds also rely on them. And there's crazy, crazy facts like grizzly bears that we wouldn't imagine would be feeding on insects at all, feed for 3 months on sometimes up to 40,000 moths per week. So these are really important components of food webs throughout the United States. And being part of food webs is also important for ecosystem services that humans gain. So we think of ecosystem services as services that insects provide to us as humans that make our lives better. So things that these insects are doing are they're maintaining natural enemies to control pest outbreaks. They act as pollinators, which I'm not going to be discussing a huge amount today because I feel like there's been a decent amount of focus on pollinators recently. And they also serve as decomposers and nutrient cyclers, preventing all of this organic matter from sort of building up around us and creating fertile soil for crops to be grown. But for me, I really hesitate to just define things in terms of what's beneficial to me as a human. I think of these creatures as fascinating and beautiful products of thousands of years of evolutionary processes as well. So let's take this guy, for example. This caterpillar I found crawling around on my patio. It was a pretty small caterpillar, maybe a second or third instar. I have about 5 different species of canopy trees over the patio, so I didn't know what it ate. So of course, I provided a little buffet of leaves from all of the different trees to try to figure out what its host plant was. Went away, came back an hour later, and I couldn't find the caterpillar at all. I was looking all over, trying to figure out where the hole could have been, where it escaped. And then finally, I saw where the caterpillar had gone. So this is a Georgian prominent, and that white line along the edge of the caterpillar actually serves as this really fascinating device for breaking up the leaf in the eyes of the predator. So it had essentially eaten all along this leaf vein, started eating down the leaf vein, and then while it wasn't feeding and was resting, just hid by pretending to be part of the leaf itself. And it's these types of kind of one-on-one interactions that you stumble across that represent these long-term relationships between these organisms that I think are really important to conserve. And I hope by the end of today to be able to convince you of preserving these things in their own right, not just because they provide us ecosystem services. And there's reason to be potentially concerned about this. We have a number of studies that you may have heard of showing insect declines. This is a very nice one that came out and is available, through an open source license. So you don't have to have a a subscription to the journal to access it. And in this study, citizen scientists did surveys across the state of Ohio on a very wide range of sites over up to 20 years of monitoring. And then they essentially looked at every single species of butterfly and tried to figure out whether abundances of that butterfly were increasing or decreasing. And what they found is essentially an overall 2% abundance decline per year in in butterfly populations. So what this amounted to over 20 years was a 33% total decline in abundance, which is a pretty alarming number to me. On the right-hand side, I've put a summary of all of the different species here. I don't expect you to be able to read it necessarily, but it's summarized here on the left, where we have 27 populations of butterflies that are pretty stable, 31 that are losers in this situation, and 9 that are winners. And that's often the complex pattern that's happening here for these species. Certain insects are able to capitalize on human-dominated landscape and development, and those are the winners here, but many more are decreasing. And so I encourage you to take a look more closely at this paper if you're interested in looking at some of these insect species specifically. But I think it is reason to be concerned, and we have some similar urbanization patterns in Maryland that might make us believe that we could be seeing some of these same declines here as well. So most places in Maryland have been cut over 3 to 5 times over the past 500 years or so. And the Chesapeake Bay watershed is losing about 100 acres of forest every day since 1985. So how did we get to this situation? What's the history of these areas? So I know that Anne mentioned that there was a speaker last week who spoke a lot more about kind of open space patterns in Maryland in general. So I'm not going to go into too many details here. And I'm not a historian. But my basic understanding is that essentially the Maryland land use patterns when indigenous communities were here was kind of a shifting mosaic of forest and open land that was dominated by hardwoods. When Europeans came and appropriated those lands, they did major clearing for agriculture through burning, which changed the landscape substantially. Then there were major harvests for industry and more intensive agriculture in the 1800s. Interestingly, by about 1920s, when the Depression hit, there was a period of major reforestation in the Maryland area, and pines became more dominant than they had been before. So actually, since 1950, about 50% of Maryland farmland has been lost. Is this going to forests? And the unfortunate answer to that is not. Instead, where it's going to is to the elephant in the room, which is development. So the pattern we're seeing in Maryland is essentially that additions to our forested lands come from abandoned agriculture. The depletions from the forest are coming from development. And this development is pretty substantive. So in the 37 years between 1973 and 2010, Maryland developed land grew by 154%, up to 1.6 million acres. And that's a total of 27% of the total land. So this doesn't include agricultural lands or any of that form of human development. This is just intensive pavement, commercial, residential areas. And the problem with development as opposed to agriculture or forest is that it's hard to go back. So once you have a landscape that's highly developed for residential or commercial, shifting back to more of an agricultural or forested landscape is pretty hard. So I think it's safe to say that this 27% of land is not going to be undeveloped. And so what I'm going to argue today is that essentially most of the forest in Maryland is private, and it's in small parcels and fragmented. This 27% of land that has been developed isn't going to be going back to forests, but we can actually use those lands to connect these fragmented habitats if we create spaces that are more conducive to the support of biodiversity. And so how might we be able to do that? So now I'm going to go through a number of different evidence-based strategies that we could use in some of these developed lands to create more insect-friendly landscapes. Now, folks have yards and woods and gardens for many, many different reasons. I'm not saying that every single yard should be, your main goal should be to have high production agriculture of insects. But I do think that these landscapes are places that can be multifunctional. And what do I mean by that? Well, I would argue that this house isn't overly multifunctional. So I kind of think of this house as the house that fell out of the sky. Probably it was built on an old ag field or potentially old forest land. This landscape requires an immense amount of energy to keep it in the state that you see here. There's watering, there's pesticides, there's removal of stumps and snags. There's all of these sort of inputs we do as humans. And in order to make an area like this function as an intact ecosystem, what might we need to do or add? So at the moment, we've got a lot of inputs probably going into this landscape. So fertilizer and pesticides, maybe water, not 100% sure, but definitely gasoline for mowing. It's a pretty impressive mowing job. We've got exports leaving from this system. So certainly grass clippings, probably not too many leaves because there just aren't that many trees to produce leaf litter, but definitely there's CO2 emissions coming from the mowing apparatus. And there's possibly nitrogen-rich runoff occurring from this as well. And so I probably don't need to tell you that this isn't an overly sustainable landscape in the sense of being a closed system. So how might we make it a more intact food web and a more functioning ecosystem? So part of the answer is certainly adding biomass. Very little biomass is being produced in this mown lawn landscape. And if we produce plant biomass, we're liable to bring in a number of other creatures that utilize that plant biomass, like insects and birds. So today I'm going to go through a number of different ways that you can create a more intact food web, because more plant biomass is good in general, but some that you add is better for food webs than others and for insects than others. And I'm going to make the further argument that yard maintenance matters, and the choices you make about yard maintenance also matter for how productive your landscape is for insects and other creatures. So first of all, I just want to review that not all insects can eat all plants. And today I'm primarily going to be focusing on herbivorous insects in general. And you'll notice that I have a propensity for caterpillars, which you'll have to humor me on. But this can be true for almost all herbivorous insects. So here you have a double-toothed prominent caterpillar, and it only eats elm species, which you can see based on its defensive spines that are shaped like the edge of an elm leaf. Now, these creatures have evolved to specialize on elm, and as a result have lost the ability to detoxify substances of many other plants. And this is because plants aren't static creatures just sitting there being chomped on the landscape. They produce a whole host of both physical defenses, but also secondary metabolites that function as defensive compounds. And these span a whole range of terpenoids, phenolics, and alkaloids. And these are substances that we as humans also use medicinally and as food. So for example, milkweeds produce cardioglycosides, and we use that within some of our medicine actually for heart attacks, which is digitoxin. Yew produces a compound called Taxol, which is an anti-cancer compound. There's also phenolics, such as aspirin is actually from willow bark and is a defensive phenolic. Fumarocoumarins, which are found in grapefruit and also other plants, are a common phenolic. If you've ever taken a drug and you've been told not to eat grapefruit while you were taking that drug, it's because of this, this secondary metabolite which is present and will actually interact with a number of antibiotics and other microbial compounds. And so that's why you don't want to be mixing it with your medicine. Lastly are the alkaloids. These are extremely common compounds that we interact with sometimes daily. Hopefully you don't use all of these every day. But these are compounds that as mammals, we respond to just as these insect herbivores respond to. And many specialized insects have actually learned how to detoxify particular ones, and some of them actually rely on those compounds for their own defense, such as monarch caterpillars, which you might have heard about. So when you look out on the landscape around you, and you see green plants everywhere, just think about the fact that all of that plant material is actually laced with a whole complex array of defensive compounds that make them not fully available to all of the insects that could possibly eat them. And so one of the ways you can help native insect populations is to use native plants. And what I'm going to show you is some data that demonstrates that, and then also demonstrates that how close to a native plant your non-native is matters for how good of a host plant that is for native insects. So first, what's a native plant? I'm sure that as a society, you guys have discussed this question to a great degree, and it can engender a lot of controversy. So I'm happy to discuss this more kind of later on during question and answer. It's complex and nuanced, but for the purpose here, I'm going to define a native plant as one that co-evolved with the community of plants and animals that were historically found in the mid-Atlantic states. And that's going to be kind of the definition that I'm using for a number of these studies. So if we think about black cherry, Prunus serotina, this certainly has co-evolved with the insects and plants of the mid-Atlantic, North America. We would call that a native plant. In contrast, autumn olive, which originated in Europe and Asia, we would consider a non-native with this framing. And so the question is, are these native plants kind of the ecological equivalents of the non-natives for supporting insect herbivores and bird populations? So I looked at this question for my undergraduate thesis back in 2007 and compared two properties, 6 pairs of 2 properties apiece that were either landscaped with native plants or a more traditional mix of lawn and non-native understory plants, but a native canopy. And so I matched the amount of biomass between these landscapes fairly well, and then sampled them for vegetation, caterpillars, and birds. So what did I find? Basically, if on the properties that were landscaped with more native plants, for an equal effort of searching, I found many more caterpillars, so Lepidoptera or moths and butterflies. And I found more of them and more species of them on the native properties. sorry. For birds, there was a very similar pattern. So higher bird abundance and richness on native properties, and importantly for me, higher birds of conservation concern. And I think part of the reason for this is that these birds are often insectivores, and it was the insectivorous bird species that responded most strongly to the native landscaping. So basically, this was a correlational study, but we were able to demonstrate that we did find higher caterpillar abundance and diversity and bird abundance and diversity in these yards that were landscaped with natives. But then the question arose, are all of these non-native plants equally poor at supporting insects? Or are there some non-natives that are a little bit better because they essentially are more closely phylogenetically related to native plants? So here, this autumn olive that we've discussed before is clearly a distinct non-native. It doesn't have any congeners in this genus within the local area of the study. However, Prunus cerulata, which is Japanese flowering cherry, is a species that is common here, but also is closely related to our native black cherry. So is it possible that because it's closely related, and there tends to be a relationship between the chemistry of plants that are closely related to one another evolutionarily, that maybe these similar non-natives would be a bit better at supporting insects? And so to look at this, we planted these four large common gardens of about 50 species of woody plants across a range of native and non-native plants that were either paired congenerically or were distinct non-natives. And you can take a look at the papers to get the exact species lists and many more details about this. But basically, we let the trees grow. This is work I did with Doug Tallamy here, and this is Chris Phillips. He's doing vacuum sampling. So we essentially vacuumed all of the trees multiple times per summer for 3 summers. And what we collected were about between 17 and 18,000 individual insects. These are just herbivores. They belong to 7 orders, 79 families, and we divided them into immature and adult species. And these covered a wide range of feeding guilds. So remember in that first, one of the first slides, I was showing you all these different ways that insects attack plants. Well, these are a number of different feeding guilds that we separated out to try to figure out if they would respond differently to these native and non-native plants. And I can tell you there was a lot of time doing these identifications under a microscope, but very cool to look at over time. So this is just a quick summary of this data, and I'm happy to discuss more of these results. But essentially, if you think about the diversity patterns here, what we find is that if you were to say plop down another garden in front of this, in the middle of this lawn of a distinctly related non-natives only, that garden would host about 46 species of herbivorous insect. And 14 of those species would be insects that you hadn't picked up in your other surveys. These are primarily generalist species. And I can go into more details if you like. If we look at a closely related non-native garden, so these are those similar non-natives, so Prunus cerulata, for example, or Tilia, or Tilia species. These supported on average 56 species, and 26 of them would be new things. So these closely related non-natives are supporting a bit more of a diverse community than the distantly related non-natives. However, if you compare either of them to the native garden, if you put it on this property, there you would get 110 species, and 43 of them would be species that you hadn't picked up on any of these other 4 gardens you planted. Those 43 new species are a term we would call beta diversity, which essentially means that as you move across space, you're creating different communities. And that's a really important thing that native plants seem to do better than these non-native species. So what's really the mechanism going on behind this? And with the caterpillar communities, we were able to drill down into this a bit more because Doug Tallamy and Kim Burley-Shropshire had put together a list of all of the host plants of all of the moth and butterfly species native to the eastern United States. And so we were able to use that list and our observations within the experiment to figure out which of these were generalists and which specialists. And basically we found that only about 50% of the generalists in our study would use a closely related non-native, and 25% of specialists would use one. However, we did get fewer individuals on these closely related non-natives. So we're not having generalists compensate in terms of abundance. On the distinct non-natives, only 30% of generalist species could use these species at all, and only 7% of specialists. So basically, specialists are not typically able to use these distinct non-natives, probably due to the fact that their chemistry is just very different than what our native herbivores are used to. Now, I will say that there were 2 species of specialists that we only found on distinct non-natives. And I think that they actually prove an important point. So this is one of those species. So this is a Lanthus webworm moth. And if you've ever come across Tree of Heaven, you've probably come across this moth. It's gorgeous as an adult. And I was so curious as to why we were finding this all over Alanthus. We only get it on Alanthus. And it turns out that it actually is an insect that uses a species that's closely related to Alanthus that was distributed down in Florida and Central America. Its distribution wasn't up into the mid-Atlantic states, so we considered it a distinct non-native. But it turns out that this caterpillar could jump over and use it. And so it is true that for some of these species, there are specialists that can jump over, but it is often due to some kind of historical or evolutionary similarity in chemistry that allows that to happen. So the rule of thumb that I would say here, if you want to support native herbivores, are to first of all avoid invasive non-natives, regardless of similarity to native community. This is simply because these actually replace plants in other habitats and can escape your yard. But if we want a hierarchy, natives are doing the best job of supporting these herbivores. Closely related natives are worse, but are still better than these distantly related non-natives. So if you have to choose a Prunus seriolata over an Elaeagnus umbellata. And I will say that there are differences among the guilds, the feeding guilds here, how the insects interact with the plants. Things like miners and gallers and chewers are much more sensitive to nativity. So if you want more details on that, check the papers and feel free to ask questions. We can also discuss distinctions within natives, like nativars versus local ecotypes later as well. So the question then becomes, why would I plant things that insects will just destroy? And I might argue, you know, you have monsters that are going to come in and eat all of your plants. Why don't you? And the answer is that you are also supporting many other creatures that come in and eat all of those herbivores. So Aaron Reed, who was at Delaware at the same time as me, did a study in the same yards that I had looked at caterpillars and birds within, and found that there was actually similar aesthetic damage levels on those native and non-native landscaped yards. So people aren't going to notice that these insects are consuming all of your plants and you don't have any beautiful garden left. If you have enough of these predators and things, you will have a balanced system and you won't actually have a ton of defoliation happening. And Desiree Narango, who was a grad student who I didn't actually work with, but came after working with Doug, has done a really nice study showing that spider abundance and chickadee reproduction are also higher on native properties. So you're creating this base of insect herbivores that are then feeding your higher trophic levels. And that's a really important concept to communicate to folks if you're trying to encourage them to use native plants. The other interesting thing that came out of this study is that she found that basically in order for these chickadees to be have a replacement rate above 1, that you could have up to 30% non-native plants. So remember, all of this is kind of dependent on plant biomass. So if you want to keep kind of your prized azalea or some other species on the landscape that you really love, that's okay. Just think about also adding biomass to make sure you've got enough natives to support your insect herbivores and also prevent outbreaks on your prized azaleas. So then for me, the question becomes, why would I want this in my yard? Other than it's gorgeous and the cutest second instar caterpillar, which you can see on the right here. It's also a mimic of tarantula skins. It came up from, it's the only member of its genus that is north of Mexico and outside of tarantula range, and it still apparently looks like a tarantula. So I would encourage you to try to plant things to get this hag moth or monkey slug caterpillar in your yard. Okay, so that finishes the first section, which is thinking about using native plants within these food webs in order to support insects. So the second thing I want to discuss is planting a variety of species. So natives are better for insects, but should you just plant one kind of native across your entire landscape? Or should you plant a diverse community around that? Does it matter? And so the question I wanted to ask here is essentially, if you plant the same tree, but you plant it in either a diverse yard or a monoculture yard, what does that do to the caterpillars that that single tree supports? And so I've been looking at this question within a large-scale tree diversity experiment. I think about each of these little diversity treatments as a yard, either a monoculture or a polyculture. And this is an experiment that was planted at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. Dr. John Parker and Susan Cook-Patton have been the leaders behind this. They planted it and had the idea, and it's an amazing resource. And it essentially involved planting 20,000 trees with a lot of volunteers and citizen scientists in March and April 2013. And they planted 16 of the most common native species. So I just want to highlight here that within this section, we're talking about all native species. So I came in and we started doing caterpillar hunts within this experimental structure. So we sampled over multiple years about 540 trees of 12 species. And we did this for trees that were either surrounded by all of their own species or 4 other species or 12 other species. And so far, we've collected about 3,000 caterpillars of about 189 species and 23 families. And what we find here on the x-axis, you have the tree planting diversity. So this is essentially 1 would be if that tree was surrounded by its own species in a monoculture. 4 would be if it's surrounded by 3 other species. And 12 is if it's surrounded by 12 different species. And what you can see is that in 2016, we had an increase of about 32% in caterpillar species if you were surrounded by a diverse mixture on the same tree. So we're always measuring caterpillars on a single tree here. And each of these colored lines is a different species of tree. So in 2017, as the plants got larger, we found that this effect strengthened. So you can see here that there's a much stronger effect of being in a diverse setting as these species are accumulating. And we find the same thing for abundance patterns as well. They mirror the richness patterns. So essentially, if you have a tree planted in a diverse neighborhood, you end up with a greater diversity and abundance of caterpillars on that tree. So what this means in your yard is essentially by having a diverse setting, you can plant the same tree but support more insects. And we also did not see this parallel increase in damage that you might expect from supporting more insects. And there's a variety of different reasons this might be the case. And we're doing some follow-up experiments looking at parasitoids and leaf chemistry and some various other possible explanations for this. So the second thing I suggest is to plant a variety of species where you can in your yard. And that's going to support more species in general. So the next thing is to add plant biomass at multiple heights. And so this kind of setting is very similar to what you might see going to any park. So you have a native canopy, but then mown cool season grass ground layer. This is also true in many yards. And what this represents is a lot of empty space that could be taken up by plants that could be supporting insects. So you can essentially add layers of plants to fit in more biomass within the same landscape. And you can do it in very aesthetically pleasing ways, I think. So just to kind of highlight this, here's my in-laws' yard in about 2010 in the suburbs outside Philly. This is a very typical landscape with mown grasses in the front, mown grasses in the back with some tall canopy tulip trees as well. The main problem that they had was essentially that when it would rain hard, they would get a river that would flow from the road through the backyard. And so what they were trying to do was prevent some of that water flow. And so they started putting in some rain garden effects and native plants. And by 2014, it filled in to a large degree. They now have a native canopy, but they're also getting an understory coming up, and I think it looks very nice. Water is being sucked up by the plants, and they do have less erosion and runoff. And personally, I think there's less road noise, creating a buffer. There's also the added bonus that there's just very pretty aesthetic components to this landscape at this point that I think was missing from the mown grass landscape. These are all pictures they took. I should probably have them as a co-author on this talk. And here's just another place where they added plants, and then they're now getting a whole host of insect herbivores. So I was very excited about this Polyphemus moth caterpillar here, but they're also getting toads and many other creatures within this landscape. This is just another area where they've added plants that's now filling in. And I think it can be done in a very aesthetically pleasing way, particularly with homeowners associations and things. I feel like front lawns are often need to be more orderly, and I think they've done it in a very nice way that's also supporting insects. So I think you can add biomass in ways that maintain the function of the landscape while also being quite gorgeous. This is another house that's just down the street from me that I admire every time I go past it. And if you go beyond this hill, this gorgeous hill of plants, you do have a very manicured small lawn area with azalea bushes in it. And those azalea bushes have not had insect outbreaks on them for years. And I suspect it's because all of these plants are providing all kinds of pest reduction services for those azaleas. So that was adding plant biomass at multiple heights. And the last thing I want to talk about is thinking about other aspects of the life cycles of these creatures while you're doing your yard care. Up until now, I've really focused on larval host plants as an important part of insect-friendly landscapes. And I think that's a very important component that we weren't really considering, 20 years ago or so. But I think we're getting better at adding some of these native plants. And I worry that potentially we might not be considering some of the other parts of their life cycle that are really key to them having populations that are able to sustain themselves. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, insects lead pretty complicated lives. So insects evolved two pretty impressive superpowers that have made them incredibly successful and diverse group of organisms that we see around us today. One of those is flight, and the other is metamorphosis. And flight is important for the dispersal of insects around these different landscapes, but I'm not really going to be focusing on that primarily today. What I'm going to be talking about today is metamorphosis. So there's a couple different flavors that insects evolved. The more ancestral insects have gradual metamorphosis. And here what we're talking about is an egg that gets laid and then hatches, and the insect that hatches out generally looks fairly similar to what the adult becomes. They tend to feed on the same plants and use the same habitats, and they just kind of gradually get more like the adult, growing wings. These guys need overwintering habitat and places for eggs. They're represented by things like plant hoppers and cicadas and lace bugs, tree hoppers, many creatures you've seen around in your yard. Now there's an even later form of metamorphosis that developed, which is called complete metamorphosis. And that's what you think about when you think about moths, butterflies, wasps, beetles, flies. And this type of life cycle, where you're really separating out your life stages from one another, has proven extremely successful. So here, the larvae and adults often feed on different foods. So think about a caterpillar that's feeding on primarily plant material, but as an adult, it feeds on nectar or sometimes doesn't feed at all. And so each of these life stages needs slightly different things. And so here's an example. This is the life cycle of a red-spotted purple butterfly, and it starts as an egg. You can find these things really easily on black cherry trees. They have these gorgeous spherical eggs that hatch and then have this really distinctive feeding behavior where they crawl out and feed along the petiole and actually attach a little frass stick, so like a poop stick, on the end of the leaf vein. And then we'll actually evade predators by sitting out on the other edge of this. So these guys are really pretty easy to find on your landscape if you have a cherry. It grows up, it pupates, and then you have your butterfly. Now the interesting thing about these guys though, is they actually overwinter as a third instar caterpillar. So caterpillars go through a number of molts, all insects do. And so it actually forms this little hibernaculum, and you can find this over winter on your black cherry trees. So if you think about what this caterpillar needs, it needs its host plant for sure, but it also needs its host plant to not get cut back and weed whacked like black cherries often are as weed trees on the landscape, so that it can successfully overwinter and then come out as a caterpillar, and then as an adult find its mates and nectar and use that part of the landscape. So insects lead complicated lives. They need host plants, they need adult food, they need shelter from predators, heat, wind, flooding. They need overwintering sites. They need pupation sites. They need someplace to lay their eggs. They need a mating spot and a mate. So all of these things are necessary in order to create sustainable populations. So here on the left, you can see a penstemon where a bee has bored out the pith and has laid eggs. And that's the overwintering place for the eggs of this bee species. On the right, you can see a copper underwing caterpillar that needs a place to molt. So this white kind of ghostly apparition on the left is a cast exoskeleton of this caterpillar. And it needed a spot to sit for about 15 hours in order to shed that skin. This is a Cecropia moth whose cocoon had actually been put on the outside of somebody's porch and then got pulled off during fall cleaning. And I rescued it and allowed it to come out on a different part of the landscape. So all of these things are important for these insects to survive. This is a hibiscus bee and a rose mallow plant. The male hangs out in the flowers and guards it, waiting for a mate to come. So these guys definitely need this particular hibiscus host plant. Predators often actually, like this chrysopid, also need to feed on nectar and pollen for energy, even as adults. And one of the major things these guys need are places to overwinter. So some of these caterpillars will actually overwinter on trees, just freezing and thawing. That's what these guys do. And they actually are about 60% of a kinglet's diet in winter. So these are providing really important food resources, but they're also not very safe in that overwintering location, perhaps. Okay, so does this feel overwhelming yet? These insects need so many different things. How can I possibly provide habitat for them? And I would say that you don't need to manage for every insect. If you essentially create a variety of these habitats and decrease the amount of cleaning that you do, you'll support hundreds of different species. And I'm just gonna highlight one management practice briefly that I've gotten really interested in, and that's fall leaf litter removal. And this is something that's done every fall, but a lot of our moth and butterfly larvae actually pupate in the soil and in cocoons in fallen leaves. And what this means is that when we remove all of this leaf litter, we're removing an important resource for another part of these insects' life cycles. So predators and parasitoids also use this resource. Birds and mammals forage in the leaf litter, and it plays a role in recycling nutrients and suppressing weeds. So I think this is a very important resource that we are currently throwing away. There's a master student in the lab who's currently examining how this is affecting insect populations. 8.5 million tons of leaf litter are removed from residential lawns in the US. And what he's essentially trying to figure out is if that matters for these insect herbivores. To do that, he's been manipulating litter out in the tree diversity experiment, but he's going to be starting doing this in people's yards as well. So what this looks like is essentially in the fall, he either adds litter, has a control, removes it, or shreds it. And then in the spring, puts emergence traps over these areas of litter and figures out which insects successfully overwintered in each treatment. And so what he's finding is essentially that the leaves are effectively buffering soil temperature. And so when you add leaves, which is this top blue line, you get much lower temperature modulations in the soil than when you remove litter, where you're getting extremely high fluctuations over the course of the day. And this is very preliminary, but he is finding that a decrease in the butterfly and moth emergence that seems to be associated with removing leaves. It's unclear whether that's because they're in the leaf litter itself or maybe because of the soil temperature modulation, but it's an interesting result that he's going to be following up on. So these leaf litter is doing all kinds of important things. Humor me for just 1 second with a different kind of leaf litter story. So this is a squirrel nest that I was finding lots of around the neighborhood, and they were falling out of trees. And when you get up close to them, the leaves are all eaten, and they were covered with these caterpillars. And so these caterpillars, it turns out, are common idea caterpillars. They actually specialize on dead leaves. And so these caterpillar species aren't eating living plant tissue. They actually require that leaf litter in order to complete their life cycle. One last way this leaf litter is very important. This happened in my lawn last year. There was an overabundance of these little tiny white and red dots that you can barely see, literally hundreds of thousands of them. If you look at them closely, they come from these structures on oak leaves. And it turns out that these are jumping gall wasps that covered the ground. Squirrels would essentially pick up each individual leaf, chomp off these little galls, which have a little wasp living inside of them. And so they were providing an important resource. So leaf litter can do a lot of things within these communities. And so that's one way that we should potentially be considering the full life cycle of critters when we're doing our lawn maintenance. Okay, so lastly, I just want to point out that you can help here within your landscapes. I'm sure you care about plants. And so individual landowner decisions can increase animal habitat. I think there's pretty good evidence for that at this point in time. And there's many things you can do. You don't have to do all of these, but these are all things that will help your landscape support more insects. And so if you could leave some or all of your leaves in place, place them under shade trees potentially, maybe move them from the front yard to the backyard, create an area where that litter is creating an understory environment rather than being aesthetically potentially unpleasing in the front yard if your neighbors don't like it. Potentially leave some standing dead wood for habitat. Maybe you could grow some native vines up that. Move your fall cleanup to late spring. Gardens don't look that great in the winter anyway, in my opinion, so might as well make them more functional. And lastly, try to convert some of your lawn and support conservation of native plants on public lands. And so there's many ways to do this. I'm sure all of you all are familiar with native nurseries. There's also options for sharing clonal plants with friends. I suggest allowing volunteer plants to establish. I just had this awesome groundsel tree pop up in my yard from nowhere, and I have a place I'm going to be transplanting it. And small spaces can provide these habitats too. So you don't need a huge space in order to create habitat that's conducive for insects. And I know that some people don't have yards or there are homeowner association rules. There you could potentially volunteer in local parks. Learning your local flora and fauna helps, just having an appreciation for insects that you can pass on to others. And lastly, trying to change the rules if you can. I think there's been a lot of progress in that regard. So the message here is if you build it, they will come. I planted a spice bush this past year in our new house, and already got these awesome spice bush caterpillars that showed up within a year. Also had cloudless sulfurs show up on our senna within a year of planting those. So these are all really cool creatures that you can bring into your yard by creating habitat through changes in yard management. So I hope that I have made the point that these guys are not necessarily the enemies of your plants. But they're beautiful, and they're also bird food and do important ecosystem services for us as humans. So with that, I just want to thank all of the folks who have helped with all of these processes. I like to show this picture because there's clearly all of these people working in the background, like this caterpillar here, hiding out in the bark, that are doing a lot of the work and provided really important aspects of this work. And there's many more resources that you can use to learn about native plants, and I'm happy to answer any questions as well. Thanks.
Okay, well, we have many questions, and many of them are very thoughtful, and I don't think we'll have time for them all. So some of the specific gardening and ID questions, maybe people can go to the other resources that you mentioned. There are several questions about leaf litter. Is it all right to move it around? Is it okay to rake it to a different part of the yard? What about shredding it first and either leaving it in place or then moving it?
Okay, so lots of questions about leaf litter. I'm going to repeat the question if that helps. So lots of questions about kind of how you can treat your leaf litter to be most conducive to insects. Honestly, there has not been a lot of research on this question. We can find a lot of articles essentially saying there needs to be more research on this, but there isn't a lot of evidence to kind of support different practices. And that's essentially why my student Max is working on this. I would say that basically anything you can do to decrease the amount that you're getting rid of or sending to the dump or whatever else is positive. So what I've taken to doing in my yard, I mean, I have oaks. And oak litter is very recalcitrant and it doesn't break down very easily. So what I'm trying to do is move that litter into beds. If there are insects in that litter itself, then they're liable to make it through the winter in the beds. Shredding, so far, what Max has found is that shredding doesn't appear to be that different from removing leaves in terms of the Lepidoptera emergence, but that's super preliminary data, and so I don't want to hang my hat on that. I think that basically you have to think about what kind of litter you have and what parts of your landscape you could potentially add it to. And so things like maple litter, they decompose in a year really quickly. Tulip tree litter, decompose. Things like oaks that have a lot of lignins take a while. And so that's going to be your more problematic litter to figure out what to do with.
Next question, is there anything gardeners can do to mitigate the risk from the new invasive spotted lanternfly?
Oh, yeah, they're beautiful, right? So is there anything that gardeners can do to mitigate the risk from spotted lanternfly? So this is a new non-native that has been moving rapidly across the eastern United States. Last year, there were only a couple confirmed places in Maryland that had it, and it's all over the place this year in Maryland. It still hasn't made it to College Park here in Baltimore. It feeds on an extraordinarily wide range of plants. I think they found 80 species at this point that include a lot of our ornamental landscape plants. So things like maple, walnut, a lot of our native trees. It's doing a lot of damage to things like grapes and hops in the agricultural world. The main thing you can do is if you have a Lanthus altissima, so tree of heaven on your property, if you can remove those trees, that will help. So basically, they seem to be fairly closely tied in terms of mating success with this tree of heaven, which is non-native here, but is native to the area that they come from. And essentially what a lot of the departments of ag are doing is creating trap trees by cutting down all the ailanthus and then essentially putting pesticides in the ailanthus that remain in order to try to decrease the populations of spotted lanternfly. So if you don't want them in your property, that's a first step. Get rid of your and your neighbor's ailanthus. And it's an invasive tree that we don't really want around anyway, so it won't be felt too heavily as a loss.
A couple of people have asked in the chat whether you could put up your last slide with the resources again. And if you can do that, we'll go on to the next question and people can still see you in the thumbnail.
Okay.
Okay, next question. Do native plant cultivars contribute more ecological or habitat value than non-natives in garden design? That's a pretty general question. Maybe you want to answer it as to insects.
Okay, so the question was, do nativars contribute to more than non-natives to garden design?
Yes.
I think the answer is definitely true in the case of insects. I think that I put up this sort of hierarchy of natives, closely related non-natives, distinct non-natives. And I think that all of our native cultivars generally will probably fit within that native category. The problem with that some people have with nativars is that these are essentially cultivars of native plants that are maintained for particular traits in a similar way to a lot of the ornamental plants in the industry. And usually you have to use clonal propagation to maintain some trait, like say purple leaves or double flowers, that sort of thing. And there's evidence suggesting that some of these traits that humans select for are bad for insects. So I think Doug and Desiree and Adam had a paper out that was comparing different native cultivars to straight species, and essentially found that the only trait that they could consistently find was bad for insects were purple leaves. So basically leaves where we have bred the plant to produce more anthocyanins, which is what creates that purplish color, are not as tasty to insects because anthocyanins are a feeding deterrent. They tend to be in leaves that are losing their color or are stressed. So basically, if you're just thinking about which trait should I avoid in nativars, avoiding purple morph plants would be one way to do it, or anything where you're shifting the color of the leaves. Now, kind of from the broader perspective of should I not use these other nativars at all, I think it's all dependent on kind of the genetic diversity in the landscape. So basically in a broader population of native plants, you have a lot of genetic diversity. And when we create these clones in particular, if they're clonal nativars, then if everybody plants the exact same clone, you aren't increasing the genetic diversity that's available on the landscape. And so if there's lots of these native cultivars available, like 100 different types or something, then I don't think it's bad if, in addition to the native diversity that's out there, you have these other nativars. But I think that in general, if you can use local ecotypes, which a lot of native plant sourcing will do for you now, that's always sort of the best way to go about it, if you can. That was a little more overarching than just native plant design. But if the question is plant a non-native or a nativar, definitely plant the nativar, in my opinion. Except maybe if it has purple leaves.
Okay, thank you. For those who asked for the website and email address, Lynn has posted those in the chat. so you can just go get those from the chat. Here is a long question which you have addressed, but I'm going to give you another chance to respond to this question because of the way it's phrased. When it comes to native plants that support insect diversity, it seems like it's a losing proposition for a home gardener. The insects eat the garden plants. Do we have to look at it like the garden isn't for beauty or for nurturing the plants, but rather for preserving the insects and insect-eating animals? Or do the insects often not eat the plants to the point of killing the plant?
Yeah, so I think from the data that we've looked at, it appears that when you create these gardens that are supporting these diverse insect communities, you're essentially creating a resource base that allows a lot of our native predators to create populations that then prevent outbreaks. So really in a garden, what you don't want is you don't want one species of insect to become so abundant that it defoliates all of your plants to the point that people notice. So in general, they found that people don't notice damage on plants until it reaches about 10% of total removal. And what Erin Reed's study found was that, at least in the yards that I was looking at, we weren't getting close. We were about 6 to 8% removal, which is below that aesthetic damage threshold for both the native and the non-native properties. I'm not sure if you're referring to vegetable garden plants here. I would say that for vegetable gardens in general, you may have to try to supplement some of your predator communities. So potentially planting some plants that are known to be good supporters of parasitoids, which are wasp species that specialize on killing insect populations. So for example, I planted a mixture of flowers that essentially provide nectar and pollen to these parasitoids and encourage them so that you have a large enough population to prevent outbreaks. And there's been a decent amount of evidence coming out of the Shrewsbury lab at Maryland and a number of other labs showing that this form of conservation biological control is what it's called, is a good way of decreasing your herbivore populations. So to answer, I don't think it's a question of either of having a completely defoliated landscape that insects are just eating everything, or having kind of a beautiful landscape with not an insect there. I think that once you get sort of the ecological system in place to have a number of these parts of the important communities there and present, that you'll create a system that's able to exist over a number of years. It may take a few years to get there, but I don't think it's really an either or.
A questioner has asked if you could address the impact of non-natives such as stiltgrass on insect populations.
Should I stop sharing my screen at this point, or should I keep?
Go ahead and show whatever you wanted to show. People can access the resource list in the recordings also.
Okay, I'll just keep it up. So stiltgrass, so Microstegium, it's a non-native that tends to take over forested landscapes. So for example, over in Greenbelt Park, there is an incredible monoculture of Microstegium in one part of the park that I've never seen an expanse this large. I think it is having impacts in the sense that it is crowding out some of the native community. So I see certain plants, like pitcher plant, will come up in the spring, and some ferns, but by this time of year, they've been completely overshaded. So yes, I think that is a non-native invasive that doesn't have any close congeners. There's a number of papers that have shown it does not support herbivorous insects. There is some interesting work that I've been involved in that shows that if the question is a barren landscape denuded by deer or microstegium, the microstegium is providing some habitat structure and biomass for decomposing insects and for spiders. So there are a few parts of the insect community that seem to get something from microstegium if there's no other plants around, which is often what deer are doing in our habitats here. So yes, I think microstegium is has quite a negative impact on the landscapes here, but I'm not sure exactly how we can reconstruct some of these native communities without also decreasing some of the deer populations.
Next, we have a question from an attendee who works as an arborist in Washington, D.C., a government street tree arborist, who says, traditionally blocks have been planted with the same tree species. Some of us are questioning this long practice and introducing new species, mostly native on the same block, working toward more diversity on the same block. Do you think this will help insect diversity as opposed to maintaining the old pattern where there is diversity, but only from block to block, like a whole block of elms, then a whole block of oaks, then a whole block of linden, instead of a mixture on each and every single block?
Yeah, I think that strategy probably makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure as an arborist, they've been dealing with the consequences of having emerald ash borer come through. And on blocks where there were ashes, I suspect that lack of diversity is probably impacting that community a lot more than if there was this alternating pattern that they're describing where maybe an ash gets lost on each block or every few blocks rather than the whole canopy for an entire area goes at once. So yeah, I think that's a great strategy. I think you'll probably have some added benefits to prevent pest outbreaks, insect pest outbreaks. So I've been talking mostly about more suburban type habitats within this talk because it's focused on homeowners. But for more urban landscapes, you end up having some pretty complicated dynamics occurring with pests because you have a number of other stressors that occur. So these trees are living in conditions where they're often in a very small tree pit. So they have water stress issues. They can potentially, you might not get the support of the predator communities because the leaf litter gets taken away every year. And once you do get a pest that makes it in, if you have this really non-diverse structure, they can just jump from tree to tree. So I think you're doing all the right things by trying to mix it up a little bit. And maybe there's even a way to kind of alternate some understory and overstory trees. So you could get some, or canopy trees, so you could get some layering and increase the biomass that way.
An interesting question is whether you think that insects would be able to use a native plant that has been mostly missing for many years, specifically American chestnut, when doing replanting.
I suspect so. And the reason for this would be that phylogenetically, chestnut is fairly closely related to a number of trees that are still major parts of the canopy. And so, for instance, you have plants that are, or species that are oak specialists. So there's 560 species of caterpillars that will use oaks. Hickories, there's maybe like 100 or something like that. And so if you have these specialists that have evolved to eat trees that are very similar, they probably could jump over. And historically, many of them maybe use chestnut and we just don't know. And so they've that was part of their original host breadth, and maybe they haven't used it for quite a while, but if it were to pop up back in the landscape, it would be probably much easier for them to move back over to using that as a host than if they had never been exposed evolutionarily to that host plant.
This next is a comment rather than a question, but I want to give you a chance to comment on it. One issue the questioner sees with convincing people to reduce their lawns and replace with native plants is that many folks have outsourced their lawn mowing. They can find companies to mow their lawns, but not to maintain areas with native plants.
I think that's true, but there are companies. I firmly believe that companies will be created if there's demand for a particular service. So, for example, native plants were not available in a lot of these commercial nurseries for a long time, and I think that consumers started demanding and asking for them, and so now producers are figuring out ways to make them more available on the landscape. And so this is lawn versus kind of shrubs and perennials versus just replacing one shrub with another is what I'm assuming this question is getting at. Many of these landscaping services, you are right, are not trained to differentiate among plants very well, and aren't kind of focused on the beds to the same degree, other than potentially mulching them and doing the fall cleanup aspects. And so you're right, it may be hard to find, but if there's demand out there, perhaps there could be landscape companies that specialize in it. I know that landscape companies and arborists and things are always looking to kind of value add to their particular industries. So maybe that's something that we could create demand for in general. But I mean, if you can always leave part of your lawn, have the lawn service do that, but just decrease it by maybe 20%, adding some of these areas. And perhaps you would have to do a little bit more of the work, or your kids. But I do think that that's one of the ways that you find these creatures and start appreciating them, is if you're actually actively out there making some of the decisions, planting plants, and seeing what's using your landscape.
Well, it's after 9 o'clock, so we're going to have to wind it up, and I apologize to everyone whose questions we did not get to, but we really would be here all night. There is so much interest in your presentation, and there are so many follow-up questions about what to do, what not to do, that we just can't get to them all. I do want to pass on one last question about ID. What is the host plant for the monster caterpillar?
The monkey slug caterpillar?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so they have a few different host plants. I have found it on ash, so fraxinus. I've also found it on oak. So you saw in that picture, I think that was a red oak, no, a pin oak that it was on, that we collected it off of. So I believe there's a variety of insect hosts that it'll go on. There's an awesome book by Dave Wagner, which is Caterpillars of Eastern North America. And it's also available as an app for your phone. And they will list host plant ranges for all of these caterpillars as well. There's also a website that I put up here, which is the Native Plant Finder, where you can pick a moth and then find out what to plant to host it. And so that would be another resource. But I believe that they have a fairly wide host range with at least 6 different genera that they feed on. But I can look it up and send more information.
Okay, well, we all want to thank you. Many people have commented in the chat and the Q&A about what a fantastic presentation this was. And thank you everyone also for your great questions. Good night, everyone.